Good evening, everyone. Happy Sabbath. Oh, I am so excited for tonight's message and for the whole camp meeting season. Have you been having a good camp meeting? Yes, this topic, this is near and dear to my heart, to our pastoral staff's heart. We, for years, have been focusing on how to help our congregation grow in their discipleship journey with Jesus, and this is sort of the culmination of a lot of that. And I'm excited to hear what Pastor Randy has to say tomorrow about how to slow down the frantic paces of our lives, and what Pastor Miguel will be sharing today in our workshop of practical steps that we can all engage in. We have some exciting things coming up this weekend, besides our 4 worship services tomorrow and our various Sabbath School programs. We also have Tune Study, Dr. Tune Study with his reunion with the octet groups that have gone through La Sierra. How many of you are familiar with the La Sierra octets? There's one of you, okay. So the La Sierra octets for many years were a famous group that traveled from school to school, area to area, telling about La Sierra and the ministry that they do, but also singing and performing. Some incredible musicians have come out of these octets, dedicated a lot of time to putting together their craft and singing. And there will be a reunion of about 30 of them performing with Dr. Chunsteady leading them and directing them this Sabbath evening at 7 p.m. is the concert. It's a free concert, so we encourage you, all of you watching online, if you're in the area, to come by and join us for that concert. Next week, we have a Steve Green concert in the evening, and if you haven't gotten tickets for that yet, we encourage you to go and get tickets for that. That is a paid concert, so it will not be broadcast, but Steve Green, that was the music of my youth. I remember growing up listening to Steve Green, People Need the Lord. I remember them doing a drama to that song. It was just powerful music, and a man who has spent years following Christ, and that shows in the music that he sings. So that's going to be on August 17th. And then on August 24th, there's an exciting Drayson Center event, but we'll let you know more about that as we draw closer. So a lot of amazing things happening, but tonight, Pastor Miguel, my colleague, will be sharing practical ways that we can engage in apprenticeship to Jesus. Let's invite Jesus to be with us as we journey through this. Our good and gracious God, we want to thank you so much for being a God who does not leave us alone to our own devices, but you step into our lives, and you not only ask us to seek you, you find us. You sought us and you found us, and then you bid us to come follow you. So as we seek to follow you, guide us in this journey is our prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.
I want to thank my friend. He's also my colleague, but I think he's my friend before he's my colleague. Joey O, who is just a joy to converse with. We spend way too much time together, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So some of you might know Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell came up with this rule that we typically use now. He calls it the 10,000 hour rule. And for Gladwell, or the premise of that rule, is that it takes about 10,000 hours of practice, just intentional time practicing something in order to become a master at a particular craft. That kind of has become pretty apparent to me, and it should to you, if you spent your nights watching the Olympics. And now I have a really interesting conversation every night in my home with my family, and that conversation has to do with what is our favorite Olympic sport. And for me, it's pretty easy. I like the 100-meter dash. I feel like that has to be kind of just less than 10 seconds now to define who you are as an athlete. So we come up with that, and usually it's the same popular sports, maybe swimming, maybe gymnastics. But then we move on to, I think, a much more interesting conversation, and that is, what is the strangest Olympic sport? And so far, at least in the Mendes household, there's a couple sports that are vying for the crown. There's the modern pentathlon, because why not? I don't know. If you don't know what that is, do yourself a favor. Tomorrow evening, turn on your computer, Google it. It'll be fantastic. And then the second one is speed walking. Speed walking. Because I feel like that's something that I could actually do. So those are kind of my two strangest sports, until I talked to somebody earlier this week that actually speed walks, and they told me that the reason why that is such a challenge is because there's a certain technique. So it's apparently if you move your soul completely off the ground, then you're disqualified. And so speed walking apparently requires some knowledge, some, shall we say, artistic training. Now, we're talking, and tomorrow, I'm going not to, like we did last week, I'm not going to spoil the sermon for you all, because that would be cruel. But we're going to talk about something that I think is particularly apropos to discuss in our current context. And that is, how do we slow down? Pastor Randy's going to be talking about kind of this process of deliberate waiting and slowing down. And interestingly enough, this idea of slowing down, of kind of breathing in and actually taking stock of your surrounding and where you are, and making sure that you are being intentional about the decisions that you're making, that has been a spiritual practice for quite a long time. Now, spiritual practices in the 20th century kind of came back into vogue because of the work of one author that I think, if you're on the pastoral staff, you'll hear us quote quite a bit, and that is Dallas Willard. Now, Willard says this: we should take aim to live our lives entirely without hurry. The peace, joy, and strength which God intended for human life, the well-being and of health of mind and body, is inconsistent with the living in a hurry. I think Willard's on to something. I think Willard is on to this recognition that if you're Jesus, and if you're a Jesus follower living in the first century, your pace of life isn't as frenetic as some might think. So like we did last week, we're gonna go to Scripture. And we're gonna look at three things, three places in the Gospels where Jesus is very intentional about stopping and being what I like to call a non-anxious presence, so living an unhurried life. So the first place we're going to go to is Matthew chapter 11. So if you have a Bible, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 11. Now, as we do typically, I got to set the stage out for you. Okay. So a couple of things that we ought to know about Matthew. Matthew is a gospel written for people that have a pretty good working understanding about what the Old Testament says. And in a sense, Matthew is actually trying to present kind of a continuation of Israel's prophetic line. So Jesus often in Matthew is presented as kind of this picture of the embodiment of the Torah. Not only is he the embodiment of the Torah, but it's interesting because in Matthew, Jesus is both lawgiver and the new covenant. And Matthew goes to great lengths to cast Jesus in this long and very wealthy tradition that Jews have about the culmination of Israel's hopes, both prophetic and national, in the person and work of Jesus. Now, by the time we get to Matthew 11, in the economy of Matthew's narrative, Jesus has been up and down the backwaters of Galilee doing stuff. But it's interesting because if you want to start, I think, a movement of renewal, if you want to start a restorationist movement, or if you want to start a political and religious revolution, I can think of no worse place to do it than the places that Jesus is actually embodying in his ministry. He is far away from the lights and the center of both national discourse and theological conversations in Jerusalem. And instead, he opts for this really strange ministry where he is finding pockets. One of my favorite commentators, Frederick Dale Bruner, as he is talking about the Gospel of Matthew, says that we could describe Jesus in Matthew as kind of an ambulance chaser. So here you have people who are being crushed by the system and the powers that be, and Jesus patiently goes and picks them up. But Jesus is doing nothing in order to actually take head on the political and religious systems that are creating these types of problems for those whom he is healing and saving. And so when reading Matthew, at least reading how the ministry of Jesus is initiated, may have a little bit or may feel a little disconcerted. Because if you remember, Jesus jumps onto the scene through the ministry of a man who is anything but meek and mild. All right, if you think about the way that Jesus kind of erupts into the scene through the preaching and teaching of John the Baptist, you're going to find that for John, at least the picture that John begins to sketch out of the Messiah is very different from the picture that we see Jesus start to fit in as we go through particularly Matthew chapter 7 through 10. John's Messiah has an axe in one hand, right? He is ready to chop down trees, and he has a shovel in the other hand, and he is ready to sift grain and wheat. Right? He's ready to separate both the grain and the wheat from the chaff. John's Messiah comes with fire. Jesus then, when we start seeing him moving up and down the backwaters of Galilee, I assume a lot of people that heard John preaching and teaching are starting to feel a bit disconcerted, right? And it's there that we go to the opening of our passage for today, John chapter 11. So, after finishing instructing his disciples, speaking about Jesus, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" So what is John actually asking of Jesus? John is actually saying, look, I got myself into some pretty hot water, both politically and religiously, because of my ministry. And this has led me to prison. And John, I think, is savvy enough to realize about that death is kind of starting to creep in. And so on the one hand, you have Jesus kind of ambulance chasing down Galilee, and you have John in prison, and he cannot hold those disparate images of what the Messiah is supposed to be. And so he sends a query. And the query is, Jesus, are you the one? Are you the one? Or should we go look for someone else? It's interesting that it's not what Jesus is doing that is causing John a crisis of faith. It is the fact that Jesus' deeds and acts are not melding with John's mental image of what the Messiah looks like. That's the problem. So nothing that Jesus has done through Matthew 7 through 10 is actually problematic or questionable, at least in John's mind. The problem is that for John, the frame of reference that John has for what the Messiah is supposed to be isn't actually lining up with how Jesus is acting. And so he is asking a question. And it's a pretty important existential question because John, as you might remember, he has gambled his very life on the fact that this is the Messiah. So how does Jesus respond? Well, verse 4, Jesus replies, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, and those who have leprosy are cleansed. The deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor." So Jesus actually asks John's disciples to follow him, and then he kind of paraphrases back the image that Isaiah has of who the Messiah is. And he says, "Look, John, it's actually happening. But it's happening in a different way." And I want you to notice something really fascinating that Jesus does and Matthew records. It seems to me that if you want proof positive that Jesus is the Messiah, you probably need to start and end with the fact that the dead are being resurrected, right? But notice that if you're thinking about the thing that lingers in the ear of the one who is to take the message back to John, they might forget the fact that the blind are seeing, that the lame are walking, that the lepers are cleansed, and that the dead are raised. But they won't forget the last thing on the list. Typically, we tend to remember the way lists end. And what is the way in which Jesus concludes? Well, Jesus says, the poor receive or hear the gospel. And in that moment, what Matthew starts to do is he moves us into this section in the gospel that can be read or understood as a homily that Jesus is offering about the true purpose of the gospel. So he starts talking the rest of the chapter. This is how it's set up. It's this question that John has. My professor, one of my favorite professors, the late great Charles Teal, used to love to talk about this particular passage. Because for Charles, it was Jesus's ultimate manifestation of the fact that the gospel, whether preached in the centers of power or in backwater Galilee, has the capacity to enact true and real social change. And I agree with Charles, but I think there's also something that is happening. You see, the homily continues, and Jesus is going to start talking about who John is, and then we get to this section that is my favorite in the chapter. And this is a section that I want to linger on maybe for just a couple minutes. So let's go to verse 25. Now you have the context. You understand who Matthew is, what's going on. Now we go to 25. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to the little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by the Father. No one knows the Son except by the Father, and no one knows the Father except through the Son and those whom the Son chooses to reveal to him. Come to me, all those who are weary, burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon me and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's how he concludes this whole section of what is the Messiah doing, and why don't we have social change, and why isn't there a revolution in Jerusalem or New York or Washington, D.C.? Why is the Messiah acting in the way the Messiah is acting? And Jesus says, by the way, the thing that I want you to remember, John's disciples, is that the poor are hearing the gospel, and he's going to conclude this section by saying, come to me, all those who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And actually, the Greek construction is a little cumbersome to explain in English, but I think it's just so beautifully stated. Because what Jesus is actually saying, and pardon me for the poor grammar, is come to me, all those who are exhausted, and I will rest you. It is so fascinating that in this whole spectrum of people who are awaiting a Messiah of action, Jesus is actually saying, come to me and discover rest. And it's impossible not to connect this idea with the idea of the whole purpose of the created order. You see, for Matthew, the kingdom of heaven is something that is breaking into time and space. So it's not just this movement, it's not just a series of teachings, it's not just really cool miracles that Jesus is performing. It is literally a new reality that is pressing up against the reality that you live in, a reality marred by pain, by Rome, by Herod, by prophets being imprisoned, by disciples that don't quite get it, by crowds that are fickle. It is a problematic world that we live in, and Jesus comes in and introduces this new reality, breaks in this new reality in the most prosaic and pedestrian way I can imagine. He says, come to me and I will give you rest. And it's very, very much the same as this idea that appears in the Jewish mindset, where the whole of creation is pointing towards this notion of rest, right? The idea was that everything, the whole created order, moved us to this concept of rest. And here Jesus is saying, come to me, I want to rest you. I want to provide you, and obviously the beautiful word that our brethren in Hebrew, in Jewish communities use is, come to me, I want to give you shalom. I want to provide shalom for you. Now here's the thing, you cannot gain shalom unless you start reinventing your relationship with time. Time is an unruly taskmaster. And Jesus here, in a society that is every bit as pressed for time as you and I are, is saying, I want to give you rest. Now, I want you to focus on how Jesus says this, because it is so moving. How does Jesus provide rest? Jesus says, come to me, those who are heavy laden and pressed. Come to me, those who live in this reality where time is a tyrant. Come to me, those who are heavy laden, and I'm going to send you on an Alaskan cruise. Right? That's what Jesus says. Come to me, those who are heavy laden, and I'm going to send you to Glen Ivy for a massage and a spa treatment. What is it? What is the tool by which Jesus introduces us into this new reality where time ceases to be a tyrant because now we're living in a rhythm of shalom, of Sabbath? How do we get there? Well, he says a yoke. Come to me, those who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And the method for his rest is take my yoke upon you. I was born and raised in Loma Linda, so I'm a city boy. Well, I don't think Loma Linda qualifies as a city. But I'm a Southern California boy. I didn't know what yokes were. But some of you know what yokes are, right? Yokes enable whatever animal to carry more weight. So it almost seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Jesus is saying, look, time is a tyrant. Come to me. Whether you are John having an existential crisis of faith, you're the disciples that don't know what's going on, or you're a fickle crowd, come to me and I will give you rest. Here's my yoke. Carry some more stuff. It doesn't make sense, does it? Have you ever wondered why Jesus says that? What is this yoke that Jesus is talking about? Well, if we stay with this idea, or if we just take verses 28 to 30 of chapter 11, then it seems, at least at first glance, that the yoke that Jesus is talking about is this new covenant, right? That he has come to establish. So come to me, all those who are heavy laden, who are pressed down, who are trying to meet up and meet those expectations that the people of Jerusalem have for you, and I will provide you a new covenant. But that reading, which is, by the way, the reading that you're going to find in many a commentary, fails to recognize the Jewish nature. That's why we spent some time, right, at the beginning talking about how Jewish Matthew is. So it's not this new yoke that has to do with a new covenant. So I'm interested if you have some guesses, because I want to build up the expectation, folks. I wonder if you have some guesses as to what this yoke is. What is this yoke that Jesus is talking about? What is this yoke that is light and gentle? I already told you it's not the new covenant. So what is the yoke? The yoke is not silence either. The way of the kingdom, okay? So the way of the kingdom. And so here's what some other commentaries will say. Who did we start this section with? John, thank you. So we started with John, and now we have Jesus. And those two images are kind of are clashing, right? John is too ascetic. Jesus is, if you keep reading chapter 11, Jesus is too liberal, too progressive. Too much liberty with Jesus. With John, it's too much asceticism. And so some people are actually arguing that this yoke is, Jesus is saying, look, if you're looking for these paragons of faith to follow, then you're never going to be pleased. So some people say it's your surrender to not just the individual or the way of life, it's the ideal of the kingdom, which I like. But I don't think that's the yoke either. Okay, we got the yoke here. What's the yoke?
Well, I will define the yoke for myself, and that is John 4:34, where Jesus says, I have come to do the will of the one who sent me and to finish his work. And when you take on that yoke, you are a revolutionary, and you are not going to be having a good time always. And it's going to be a tough battle all the way.
I like that. So the yoke is the will of the one who sent him. Okay, so we've got the way of the kingdom, the will of the one who sent me. What might this yoke be?
He says, take my yoke and then learn, because I am humble and lowly. So the yoke would be, instead of like society is, we gotta push, we gotta go higher, we gotta get the gold medal. So we gotta put 10,000 hours of this and that. Instead of doing all that, then you go after giving the gospel to the poor. Instead of getting the gold medal, you go to the last place and go to the lowest people, the untouchables, the very bottom of the caste, not the kings and then 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way to the bottom. Go to the untouchables, and that's going to be painful because nobody's going to want you to be there.
No, but yeah,
That's the yoke.
That's good. That's good. I like that. I like that.
I was going to say that it incorporates the values of the Beatitudes.
Okay. Yes, it does. So remember, Jesus is kind of constitution for the kingdom, right? This is the law of the kingdom that is breaking into the reality. So, all good answers. I can't say they're wrong. But I think we're missing something. So, okay, by the way, who's carrying this yoke? Is it just you? Okay, so it's basically this yoke that Jesus is carrying with you, right? So everything that you're asking to do, that Jesus is asking you to do, is something that Jesus is already doing. Now, I want you to think how this whole section starts. So you have John, and you have this whole excursus on what the Messiah has come to do and how the Messiah doesn't fit, or the image or the idea of the Messiah doesn't fit with John's mental framework. And then you have Jesus start this section here with verse 25. And verse 25 is a prayer. I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned and have revealed them to the little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except through the Father, and no one knows the Father except through the Son, and those whom the Son chooses to reveal him. What is the yoke? Basically, this idea of shalom is that Jesus is trying to bring you in to the reality of the triune God. The same relationship that Jesus has with the Father is now the same. By the way, Jews believed that creation was an act that spawned out of God's of this conversation, this perfect harmony that occurred within the Trinity. And it's beautiful. If you think about it, one of old theologians that I actually appreciate a lot, Robert Horns, who's a Scottish theologian, says that what this passage really is about is that God is drawing you near in such a way as to draw us near to himself within the circle of knowing himself. So you are actually being invited to participate in that same self-sacrificial relationship that drives the conversation or the dialogue within the Trinity. And so the yoke is the yoke of a new type of relationship that actually upends the way in which any other relationship in your life is oriented. Relationship to others, relationship to the kingdom, relationship to the will of the Father, relationship to the Beatitudes. All of these relationships that you have are now seen and expressed in a different light. And I think the Message Bible has it right in the way it translates this particular text. It says, are you tired? Yes. Worn out? Absolutely. Burned out on religion? You got it. Come to me, get away with me, and you will recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me, work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you will learn how to live freely and lightly. So within this idea of Jesus calling us to rest is kind of this new relationship that we have vis-a-vis God. And what I find truly, truly amazing is that through the Gospels, this relationship is made manifest in the way that Jesus has his interactions with people. So I want to look at just two, because otherwise we'll be here all night. Just two places in which this vision becomes a reality in the Gospels. The first one is going to be in Luke. So we're gonna hop over to Luke chapter 8. We're going to look at verses 40 to 54. Luke 8, 40 to 54. Now, really quickly, let's tell you what's actually happening in the story. Luke 8, 40 to 54. You know this section. You have Luke walking. Actually, you have Luke probably chuckling. Luke's a physician, after all. And you have Jesus walking. There's a lot of people. As he is walking, he encounters a group of people from one of the rulers of the synagogue. His daughter is really ill. And then the ruler of the synagogue says, "Come, my daughter's sick." And Jesus goes. And the crowd, who throughout the Gospels is kind of this interesting, almost amorphous character. You never know where the crowd is, theologically, emotionally, spiritually. They're fickle. So they start pressing up. Actually, the Greek says that they start choking in on Jesus. And there's a girl who's sick. This is an emergency. She's 12 years old, and she's dying. And the crowd is following because they want to see a miracle. Which is really most of the time the relationship that we have, or that we learn to have with God, right? Most of the times, I wish I could tell you that I am kind of the keen observer on the edge, just recording what Jesus says. But the reality is, most of the time, I'm too busy. I'm part of the crowd. I follow when I think there's going to be something interesting or miraculous. Or, let's face it, when my life is in such disarray that I need something interesting or miraculous. So here I am following Jesus as part of the crowd. Luke goes to great lengths to remind us where we are situated. Jesus has just returned from a Gentile land, and he's back in Judea. He's back in with the Jewish people. The crowd's pressing up against him. There's a 12-year-old daughter of a man who is dying. And in the crowd, there's also a woman. And she's been sick, Luke tells us. for 12 years. And the crowd is pressing. And the woman is taking this enormous risk, right? Within Jewish and Greek society, porous things that weren't firm or solid, were seen as defective. And this is the way that Luke describes this woman. She's porous. There's an issue. There's a flow. She's defective. And she's pressing into I just want you to picture the scene. Heightened anxiety. People desperate. Curiosity. A man begging and probably pushing through. The officials at the synagogue leading the way, and a woman. And she touches the edge of Jesus' robe. And she is healed. So there's a lot of things happening here, right? For starters, to touch Jesus, if you're having, as a defective person with an issue of blood, means that now Jesus is ritually impure, right? So that's a problem. This woman has operated on the periphery of society. Her relationships have been defined by attempting to keep as far away a distance from those whom she can come and then defile. And so Luke builds the crescendo in the narrative and says that she came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately the bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Who touched me? And Jesus asked, when they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. And I love the way in which Luke describes this. Then, the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed. The Greek word there that appears in the English as unnoticed is lanthano, and lanthano carries within it this idea that you are trying to hide, you are trying to remain inconspicuous, you are trying to become invisible. Why does Luke use this language? Because, friends, this woman had tried to go unnoticed for how long? 12 years. 12 years of this woman becoming an expert in camouflaging herself. And the moment she encounters Jesus, what happens? It's not only that she's healed, it's that she cannot go unnoticed. You see, this new reality where the kingdom starts erupting into everyday life, this new reality where Jesus says, come away with me, this new reality is all about the restoration of relationships. And so, Jesus is going to do something in the most inopportune time, right? There's somebody, remember, by the way, lest you forget, there's somebody dying. And what is Jesus going to do? He is going to notice her. He's going to pause. He's going to notice her. And then he says to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. That instant, at least in Luke's narrative, is an attempt for us to gauge and understand that the purpose of living in the kingdom, this call to be in this new type of relationship, a harmonious relationship with God, the same type of relationship that exists within God's self, that type of relationship means that we start noticing. So, who is it that you're not noticing? Yeah, I read this story this week. And I have a neighbor. There's always a neighbor, isn't there? And my neighbor is a police officer. And I actually am pretty introverted, as most of you know. With my neighbor, it's worse. Not because he's a bad guy. They're great people. But last year, I had a little accident on my front lawn, and my neighbor's wife had to pick me up. My back seized. It was very embarrassing. She found me on the floor. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes, I'm just laying here." She said, "Really, are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." She said, "You don't look fine. Matter of fact, you're crying." I said, "I'm not crying. You're crying." And then she called the ambulance and actually picked me up. And ever since then, every time she comes out once during the Sunday mornings to wash her car, and I'm out there watering the lawn, I'll run back inside because it's embarrassing. And I've realized that is a person I'm not noticing. And so, if I'm really honest, this idea of rest, of a relationship with God that forces you to take some time and stop, is going to force you to start seeing some things that you otherwise maybe aren't paying attention to. And by things, I mean people. So Jesus stops and speaks to this woman and says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." Because by doing so, Jesus is now reintroducing her into the society, right? And the word that Jesus uses for healed is, the root of that word is zozo. So actually what Jesus is saying is, woman, your faith has saved you. This relationship of rest and paying attention and Jesus saves her. So he stops for the woman, but he's not done. Oh no, not by a long shot. Not by a long shot, friends. Come with me to Mark chapter 8. This is going to be fantastic. Okay, actually, we're going to go to Mark chapter 7, sorry. Okay, now, so where did this healing in Luke happen? Happens in Jewish land. Jesus touches a woman and a corpse, woman with blood, body. Jesus is declared ritually unclean, except in Jesus, all of those relational dynamics shift, and so what was unclean now becomes clean because Jesus has touched it. There's a whole gospel message there. And then he does this in Mark, and I'm just going to read the story because it's one of those really weird stories. I want to start with verse 31. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down the Sea of Galilee and the region of Decapolis. And there were some people who brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears, and then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, "Ephphatha," which means be open. At this, the man's ears were open, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded him not to tell anyone. But the more he did so, the more people kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Have you ever wondered about this story? Actually, have you ever read this story? Have you ever wondered? Or maybe it's just me. I mean, this is Jesus. Couldn't he have just said, hey, hear and speak? What is this business with the touching and the spitting? Have you ever wondered? Any ideas? Why is Jesus touching it, putting fingers in ears and spitting, and then he actually says, Ephata, be open. That's good. That's good. So just think about this, right? My kid always said, my eldest always says, Dad, if you had to, my eldest is weird. I love you, Micah, but he's weird. He always asks me this really weird question. He loves to ask me these questions. He says, Dad, if you were to lose one of your 5 senses, which one would you choose? And I always say taste. And then I got COVID and I immediately regretted that decision. I think it would be my hearing, because in our society, we do pretty well with kind of being able to have people communicate in other ways. And I think in our society, because we're a visual society, the sense that we prioritize above all others, is your ability to see. Strangely enough, this is part of a broader scope and a broader section in Mark's narrative that's going to start with this story. It ends with a very similar story, except its eyes now being opened. A lot of commentators say that this is kind of the introduction, and the real important story is the one where Jesus opens the eyes of a blind man, and the blind man can't see clearly. And in Mark's narrative, that man is a stand-in for the disciples. I think those commentaries are correct in the sense that there's a deeper meaning to the healing of the blind man's miracle. I think they missed the boat on this one. And they missed the boat because a lot of us forget that Jewish society is not a visual society. It's an oral society, right? Most people were illiterate in Judea. The way that you learned, the way that you communicated, the way that you participated in social life was through your capacity to hear. And this man has been, by all intents and purposes, shut out from that community. Mark is a really interesting gospel, friends, because Mark's gospel is physical. It presents kind of the brutality and the physicality of life in first century Judea. And because it's a physical gospel, it depicts kind of these scenes and these motifs of Jesus as this man of action, this divine warrior, if you will. There will be this scene of fishermen on a boat, and the boat is being tossed around, and Jesus will come out, and unlike in any other gospel, he says, "Silence." And he yells out this command. It's guttural. It's physical. Peter will say, when Jesus explains to Peter the way of the cross, Peter will say, "This will never happen to you." And Jesus says, "Oh, Pete, you just don't understand the gospel. You need to have a course in soteriology so that you can get it. Is that what Jesus says? No, it's a guttural gospel. It's a physical gospel. He says, get thee behind me, Satan. It's a physical. Actually, you will find that Jesus' ministry in Nazareth is placed to a halt because people there won't believe him. It has this image, same image. I'm doing some repair works in my house, and there's this bolt that just won't budge. And there I am twisting at it and grunting and pulling and pushing, and the bolt doesn't budge. Physical. And here is Jesus in the midst of this physical gospel with someone that hasn't heard. Someone that's invisible, right? And the way that this often gets preached is, well, there was this person, he had a disability, and folks, we need to look at people with disabilities. But that would be to forget that Mark is a physical gospel. What is it that makes this so tragic? Well, this man can't hear the gospel. It's not just that he can't hear. It's that he can't hear the gospel. The reality that you have been called to come when you are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. Amidst a life that, like a crowd, is pressing up against you, choking you. And there's going to be days where you're going to try with all your might to make that bolt turn, and it's not going to turn. Happened to Jesus. There's going to be days where you might feel like you want to hide. And so Jesus stops and says, let's get physical. Because rest itself is a decision that is going to take your whole body. This relationship with God is going to take every single ounce and fiber of self-control, of passion, of desire, of care, of strength that you have. Jesus conducts this healing in this particular way because he wants this man to hear and speak the gospel. And what is the gospel if not rest? John Mark Comer, whom I think Randy's going to quote tomorrow, and if he does and you see this quote, please don't tell him that I used it before, says to walk with Jesus, because all of these miracles really are about that. The woman who is an outcast of society now gets to walk in newness of light. The disciples and John, who are having an existential crisis, now get to walk with full confidence. This man that hasn't heard or spoken the gospel or is able to speak the gospel now hears and speaks. And even if Jesus says and gives him this mark in secret, don't tell anyone, Mark says, by the way, everyone knew. And there's this new reality to life. To walk with Jesus is to walk with a slow, unhurried pace. That's what he's talking about in Matthew. When's the last time you walked with Jesus slowly to hear the gospel? When's the last time you walked slowly with Jesus in order to see those things, people, places, moments in life that were unnoticeable. And when is the last time you walked with Jesus without an agenda and you just rested? To walk with Jesus is to walk a slow, unhurried pace. Hurry is the death of prayer and only impedes and spoils our work, never advances it. So let's walk slowly, friends. We've got about 3 minutes for comments. We're going to start back there. Or we'll start up here. Perfect.
I was just going to say that, isn't that the way our personal devotion time is supposed to be?
I don't know. For pastors, no. Sometimes we don't do it like that. I'll admit it. I'm having my personal devotion in the morning. I'm like, man, that would make a really good sermon. Or, man, that would be great. Next time my uncle comes to town, I'm going to give him this quote. He's going to love that because then I'm going to show him that I'm right. Right? When's the last? So I think it is the way our personal devotion is going to be, sadly, because we are in a produce mode most of the time. Even our walks with Jesus are not, often our walks with Jesus are not devoid of an agenda.
That's why I say it's supposed to be
Yeah.
slow,
Slow.
unhurried,
And without
and
an
spend
agenda.
time to listen to what the Lord has to say.
And just one more caveat. When the Lord speaks, it's going to distress you. That's how you know it's the Lord. If it's what you already thought, or it's simply reinforcing the way you already felt, then that's probably not the Lord, because you could have gotten there by yourself. So when it's the Lord, it's distressing, it's uncomfortable, it's guttural, it's visceral, it's a mess, but it's also beautiful.
Dr. Mendez, the whole concept of relationship with Christ and the yoke takes my mind back to our farm, where we always had 2 animals in a yoke. And sometime one was not cooperative. So we will release him and put another one who will be more cooperative. And one could not go faster than the other. They had to go together. And they had to go at the same pace. And so this whole idea when Jesus says, take my yoke, and he is stronger than we are, and he will probably carry the weight while we are still there. And so walking this whole quotation that you have up there, when you are yoked with Christ, you can't run ahead of him, behind him, or run circles around him. You're going to have to walk with him and at the same pace that he wants you.
You got to walk with him. And here's the problem. I don't like my yokes light. We like heavy yokes, don't we? We love our heavy yokes. Jesus says, hey, take my yoke, it's gentle and light. And I'm like, nah, that sounds too good, right? I want my yoke heavy. So we add a bunch of things into the walk that don't need to be there. Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to, I think, pray, unless there's another comment or question. Going once, going twice. Okay, we're going to pray. And the way we're going to do it is we're just going to do it unhurriedly. You pray right there sitting, and when you're done, you just quietly, you can step, and we'll see you tomorrow. Amen.